My name is Nancy Chen. I'm an educator at the Art Institute of Chicago. And just some welcome announcements. Like I just said, this event is being recorded and we hope to share a copy later on. And the program will be approximately 45 minutes with Rachel Cohen guiding us through part of the Monet and Chicago exhibition. And she'll be inviting you all to respond in writing. So definitely keep using the chat. And important to note, closed captioning is available. So for anyone interested in closed captioning, on your Zoom menu bar, there should be an icon. On mine, it's to the right, that says closed caption. And if you click the caret arrow and then show subtitle, you should have captions. So thank you, Kathy, our captioner, for supporting that. And then again, it seems like you all have really helped us warm up the chat. If you have a comment or question at any time during the program, please feel free to use the chat function and don't be shy about having a conversation during the presentation. And we will have, towards the end of this hour, time for Q&A with Rachel and myself. So next, we would like to thank JP Morgan Chase for their support of this program and for their lead corporate support of the exhibition. And thank you to all our sponsors for making this possible. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Rachel Cohen has just published Austin Years, a memoir in 5 novels, a book about close reading in a time of grief and transformation, which was a New York Times editor's choice this summer. During the pandemic, she has kept an online notebook about close looking at art from far away. The entries are collected as the Frederick Project on her website. You can see the link on the slide here. And the project has featured in essays she has written for The New Yorker Online and LitHub. Her presentations on close reading and looking draw international audiences and are at the center of her teaching practice. She is professor of practice in the arts and creative writing at the University of Chicago and teaches courses on writing about art and writing in times of crisis. So with that, it's my pleasure to pass the virtual microphone to Rachel Cohen.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I'm so glad to be here. Good morning. I'm so pleased to be here with you today, and thank you for taking the time in the midst of our very challenging life at the moment to think about art and to come together in this way. It was very moving to read through all your museum visits in the chat and to think about all the art seen and unseen in this time. I want to thank Nancy Chen and Michael Green and everyone at the Art Institute for having me and for all their help in preparing this conversation. And all of you, the supporters and membership and docents and participants at the Art Institute for keeping this institution going in this time. Today, I want to share with you some practices of slow looking and of keeping a notebook that are part of the way I go to museums and the way I teach at the University of Chicago, and of the online notebook I keep about looking at art. Their practices developed over decades, partly in working on a book that I'm working on now, which is about painting and time. All of these practices have really helped me in recent months when the museums have been closed or when we were only able to get into them for little tiny brief spots of time. My own recording and note-taking is part of how I keep art with me right now. And I'm happy to be able to share that. So have your notebooks ready if you want to take notes or make drawings as we go. That's part of my plan for how we can think about it together. And we'll be pausing to go as we go to reflect, sometimes just to write a few words or to make a quick sketch or to craft a whole sentence. So if I could have the first slide, please. What I've chosen to do today with you is to explore in depth the last very beautiful room of the Monet and Chicago show that's up at the Art Institute. I saw in the chat that some of you have seen this, so you'll have the atmosphere with you. It's up until early January and curated by Gloria Groom, whose ability to create a final transcendent room in a show is really unparalleled. If you had the chance to see the Manet show last year, you'll maybe remember that experience. So here we are entering, and you can see 7 of the 8 paintings in this room. They were completed between 1900 and 1920. Some belong to the Art Institute, and some are rarely seen works belonging in private collections. 7 are famed water lily paintings, and the one at the far depths is of the irises that Monet planted in great bunches next to the water lily pond. Now, next slide. If you entered the show, the first thing you would do is turn to the left, and you would see this material and this late olive green painting of the water lily pond, which is where we're going to wind up our virtual tour today. So we'll come back to this painting. But I'm going to stay here in this slide and this feeling of not quite yet being able to see the paintings, just to set the scene for you a little bit and give you a bit of background about Monet. This is a sort of didactic material version, but I wanted to explain to you why it feels so appropriate to me to be thinking about Monet at this moment. The late water lily paintings, you may know, were done in a time of real trouble for Monet and his family and the world. Monet's beloved wife Alice died in 1911, and his eldest son Jean died in 1914. His second son, Michel, and his stepson, Jean-Pierre Hosquedet, were both serving in the military and were at the front during the whole of World War I. So, and Monet's house and gardens at Giverny, where all of this was painted, were 50 kilometers from the front. He could hear shooting as he painted. Many of his neighbors evacuated, but he stayed. The day after the armistice was signed, he wrote to his friend, Georges Clemenceau, about giving some of his water lily paintings to the government to be a monument for peace. So these works that seem so peaceful are really meant to be peaceful and deeply intended. They're bound up with trouble, and the peace in them is a hope and a labor and a commitment, a very self-conscious one. Next slide, please. Here is Monet reflecting in a letter of December 1914 about his practice. Yesterday, I resumed work. It's the best way to avoid thinking in these sad times. All the same, I feel ashamed to think about my little researches into form and color while so many people are suffering and dying for us. Next slide, please. Now let's turn to the beginning of the show, before some of these troubles began, when Monet really began painting the Japanese bridge and the earlier water lily paintings. Next slide. There you can see our first painting, the Japanese bridge, and next slide. There. This is the Art Institute's photograph, the one included in the catalog of the show. I've included these complete images so that you can see the sort of the whole of for each of the 8 paintings we're going to look at, but most of the images are ones that I took myself in my actual visits to the show. So you'll see both my own photography, and you'll notice that the tonality of my photographs is quite different. The hot colors come out much more in the images I've taken. So the official reproductions have much more blue and green in them, while my images have much more pink and orange, lavender, viridian. I think this is actually true to the experience of seeing them, that they are hotter than they look in the usual reproductions. Next slide. See how bright comparatively? This is a detail I took. You may know that Monet lived to a very old age. He died at 86 in 1926. And for the last more than 20 years of his life, he worked very intensely on paintings of his own garden in Giverny, where he had planted thousands of flowers himself, and then with the help of a staff of 6 gardeners. He met with them every day. The garden was his constant concern and project. In the year this was painted, 1900, he did 18 studies of the water lilies and the Japanese bridge, and eventually he painted nearly 300 works of the water lily pond. So this is the beginning of what would be an incredible study, returning again and again to this one landscape and painting it in every light and mood and season. Next slide. Here I photographed from an angle. This is how it would look if you approach the left side of the painting. And from this angle, the photograph mimics an experience your eye would have of plunging down that cataract of yellow, green, crimson that might be from a willow tree that was planted near the pond and reflected in it. Monet also painted weeping willows a lot, which are a symbol of mourning, though here I find this a joyful set of colors. Look at that long straight line down, continuing into the water. Next slide. And now next slide. Now, get out your paper and pencil or pen. What's something you notice in looking at this? Just quickly make a note to yourself, just a phrase or a single word. I'm going to make notes too. You might hear my paper scratching. Is it the colors, the structure, the light? What catches your eye? So here is a page from my notebook when I was at the show a week ago, last Monday. Next slide. Oh, I see people are answering in the chat too. That's great. So you can see this is the kind of sketch I mean. Now, very rough. I made a quick sketch, and you probably can't make out my terrible handwriting, which reads 1900 Bridge, Lessons to Himself about Horizontals and Verticals. Yes, interrupted reflection. I think that's right. And now, next slide, please. I love this detail. It's a bit blurry at the top, but I think you can really see the reflection of the willow strands in it and kind of see how they establish this vertical. If you're making notes separately, not only in the chat, you might want to add something about color or shape, what strikes you, and stay close to direct observation. Oh, I see. I think some people are writing only to me, so then we're getting some wonderful responses that not everybody is seeing. You can re-enter them if you want by checking all panelists and attendees instead of just all panelists. But some things that people have noticed that I think are really wonderful are a sense of interrupted reflection and a way that there's almost a quality of stairs. I think that's very well observed, and that's something I'm interested in. How Monet is establishing horizontals and verticals and how that's giving a sense of depth in the paintings. Next slide, please. Now we go back to the whole and see how now you can see it. I think even in the slides, you have this experience of returning with your close observations in hand so that they inform now the way that you see the whole painting. I would add in your notes anything that you notice about the change in perspective when you come back to the whole. I just want to bring you forward and to the left a little bit also so you can see that wonderful bunch of grasses. Next slide, please. There are the grasses, and we can go in closer still next. There we are. And I want to draw your attention to this kind of blue and purple path that seems to kind of lead you back. It's emerging in the front of the painting. And you can see it well in a detail that's actually an official museum detail. So we'll switch back in tonality to the blue-green. Next slide. There. Those are, they are almost like steps. They're like these flat planes on top of the descending verticals. Pathways of color through a painting are going to be absolutely critical for mid-century abstract expressionist painting. That's going to learn so much from Monet, especially for some artists, Joan Mitchell, Jean-Pierre Riopelle. They lived in a house right next door to, practically next door to Monet's house, just in the next town and almost abutting. For Sam Francis, who really studied Monet. And even for contemporary painters, filmmakers, installation artists who are still really working from this territory. I'm thinking of Jatovia Gary and her very powerful work in the Giverny suite of just the last few years. Now, next slide. 3 paintings from 1904 to 1906, water lily studies. This is the wall of the room in the Art Institute. And if we could have the next slide, you can see the water lilies of 1905 there. from a private collection. This is the Art Institute slide. And then you'll see, next slide, mine, of the, that's how it looks on the wall. There's a lot more kind of purple and warm tones. Next slide. There. Now already in a detail, you can see a kind of S-shaped path of purple, blue that's curving around the horizontals of the clustered lily pads. Next slide. And here, notice the already quite abstract shape of the lily pads and the rough lines of olive green and dark green that define their edges. I think the roughness is really interesting, even in these fairly early paintings that are 1905, 1906, comparatively early, late for Monet, but not yet the abstract ones we're going to see later. Next slide. Monet's signature is always in an interesting color, and he used his signature to offer you, I think, a little advice about what to pay attention to in the painting. Here he's used this deep red purple on a background of lavender mauve. And if you keep that in mind, it has an interesting effect. The next slide. Yeah, if you see the painting again, now you can hold that kind of purple and that reddish purple in mind as important for the structure of the painting. Now, get out your notes. We're going to go through some details and you can make notes. Next slide. So just look at this for a minute. Maybe draw or write a few words about space, maybe the space of the painting or the relationship of the space you're in to the space of the painting. Yeah, someone says there's an absence of clear perspective. But go ahead and make notes to yourself if you like. Now, if you look toward the upper right corner of this slide, as we change, you'll get a depth effect that's like taking a step back from the painting in person. So look at the upper right-hand corner at those kind of pink lilies up there. And now next slide. Do you see how it suddenly drops back? It's quite interesting. He's moving space so much within areas of the painting, and then you get these kind of ridges and turns as your eye kind of gets accustomed to the different parts of the painting. Now, if you're like me, that'll make you want to go in closer still. So next slide. There, that's that area of blue that's in the middle. It's a really wonderful shape, and it's a shape that recurs in these paintings, even though it's so irregular. And we're going to go kind of through a progression of nearby images closer and farther. Feel free to be making notes either to all of us or to yourself. Yes, I see people saying that their eyes are drawn into that center color. I think they are meant to be. Next slide. And next slide. Next slide. You're really seeing this pathway emerging, this darker pathway. Next slide. And next. Great. This is one of my favorite moments with that roughened green in the lower right corner that anchors this and helps to define the depth and the stretch back. Now, if you're ready, we're going to look at the whole again. Next slide. Your eye has gotten familiar with it, I think, hasn't it? You really know this whole painting. When I looked at this for a prolonged time, I came to feel that Monet was doing with his looking very much the thing I'm trying to learn to do in my own looking, which is taking details and areas, eliminating the sense of edges, going deeply into one area and letting that area tell me as much as it can. That's the quite shocking change he's made from the bridge paintings of around 1900 to these canvases of 1905, 4, 5, 6. these are unframed in a really deep sense. I mean, of course, they have these elaborate ornate frames around them, but the paintings don't have a traditional frame. They're very obviously meant to be part of continuities. And this is importantly related to the influence of Japanese work on Monet and the Impressionists generally. And I'll say more about this as we go. The show itself helps us to recognize Monet's commitment to unframed continuity by including on the wall this quotation, which was written down by the wonderful art critic Roger Marks after he'd spent a lot of time talking to Monet. Marks kind of half imagined this in a literary dialogue he made up with the painter, though it's often reported just as something that Monet said. Next slide. The illusion of an endless whole, of a wave with no horizon and no shore. The next slide. Now we're just going to glance at the next three paintings in order to prepare ourselves for that far wall of water lilies where we'll get to spend our time. Next slide. Here is a different palette, a dark green and rusty red water lilies painting from 1904. Here is my own taken at an angle. Next. Yeah. These colors are just outrageously beautiful together. And again, that effect of steps that many of you have noticed is very pronounced. Next slide. Here's the signature clue in this one. See what a bright red against a very dark background with plum and green in it, or even a deeper purple than that. And you'll be able to see that kind of holding down a corner. Yes, red abyss, says somebody. When we have the next slide. This shot is crazily at an angle, but do you see how that red of the signature holds that front corner of the painting and allows for this experience of really pronounced entry? Next slide. These are just the colors, get a sense of the texture. And the next slide. Yeah. And the wider shot again. Next slide. Thanks. I can tell you that in person, this painting made me think of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon with the vertical strips of grasses hanging down in the reflections beneath the cantilevered levels of the water lilies. Now let's move on to the next painting. Next slide. This is the third painting on the wall, a beautiful blue-green painting belonging to the Art Institute, which many of you may be familiar with from trips either long ago or recently. As you may guess, it also has a lot of purple in it too. Next slide. That's the tonality in my photographs. I'll just show you a few details in passing. Next slide. Yeah, and next. Great. Now, it's important to hold in mind how powerful Japanese influence was on Monet and on all the Impressionists. The Japanese ukiyo-e prints that circulated widely for the first time in this era, the famous woodblock prints, the Hiroshiges and the Hokusais and all the others, the Utomaros, had a profound effect. They were collected by all the Impressionists. Monet had many at Giverny. And one thing you remember about those is the way that they're cropped so that the edges cut through the picture, which gives you the sense of continuity beyond the edges. And the prints were referred to as being of the floating world, and that is very much the sort of sensibility that Monet is interested in, and is obviously just sort of directly, literally relevant for what he's creating here. Now, next, please. You can see the shape of water, very similar shape again here, with those sort of upward extensions, blue and purple, similar to the one we were seeing before. And now we'll move on to the irises. Next slide. this is a masterpiece that you may know from the Art Institute's collection. We could spend hours just with it, but in fact, we're going to use it as a transition in this visit, because I just want to bring out for you how much his paint texture changes, his handling and his brushwork between that, say, that last painting or that last group of water lilies that we were looking at. This painting is 1917, so it's 11 or 12 years later than those paintings. And I want to look closely so you can see the kind of paint. Next slide. Irises are flowers that are painted over and over in China and in Japan. Planting Japanese flowers was one of Monet's innovations. And you may not know that he had to actually apply to the municipality for permission to plant the water lilies. His neighbors distrusted these. They called them foreign plants, and they thought they would poison the water and their cattle. So sort of an interesting xenophobia and nationalism in the plants themselves. So Monet's choice to plant and paint these flowers were actually a kind of political stance for openness, trust, and the influence of other artistic traditions. Next slide. Oh, it's so beautiful. And next. The brushwork here is very free, and you can really see how the influence extends toward Joan Mitchell or some of the other later abstract painters. And then the next paintings we'll be looking at, which are finished after the armistice, when he had promised them as a stance for peace, are even more abstract. Just by way of contrast, let's just go back to the grasses from 1900. That's the next slide. Sorry, one more. There, that's the kind of painting from before. And now we'll go back, next slide. See how much flatter the paint is, how much more it's sort of on the surface, all of the colors layered over one another, and not the same kind of sense of depth at all. All right, now on to the late water lilies, our final wall. Next, please. There they are, the three together. And next slide, the water lily pond of 1919, which is in a private collection. Beautiful painting. Next. So here's my photograph, which shows the yellow signature in the bottom corner. Yellow is the guiding spirit of this painting. When we go in a little closer, we're going to go down to the right-hand corner next. There you see the signature, and do you see at the top of that image this kind of yellow cursive line that's like, it really looks calligraphic. And I think it's interesting that there's so much writing in these late paintings. Now I want to give you a chance to kind of sink in a little bit. So next. Yeah. This is a close place to sit where you can really see the texture, different textures of the paint. Just note the things that you notice. And if you want to tell all of us, then put all panelists and attendees, or note in your own notebooks if this is a private practice that you're thinking about. Next slide. A bigger area that you can see what we were looking at within. I think it's very helpful in making notes to have a moment of retrospect. Just look back at things that you noticed, at the more concrete observations you were making, and see if you can find phrases or sentences that link the things together a little bit more. We're going to head to the left edge of these yellow leaves. Next slide. And next slide. This is one of my favorites. Yellow calligraphy is really a key to understanding this painting. I always find it hard to decide whether to leave a painting by being close to it or stepping back from it. But in this case, we're going to leave from close by. So the next painting, which belongs to the Art Institute, thank you, is larger and wider. This is from 1917/1919, so I think he worked on it and then returned to it. Began it before the end of the war, finished it after the end of the war. Most of what we've been looking at are square format paintings, but this has a little bit more the effect of those very long late water lilies that were the center of the gift that Monet made to the Orangerie to commemorate the peace and to stand as a monument to peace. Some of the other long ones are at the Museum of Modern Art and the Cleveland Museum of Art. Sometimes in the last few years, these have been reunited for different exhibitions you may have seen. So here's my photograph. Next slide, please. That's what it looks like on the wall. And that purple path down the center of it, you'll be able to see in the next slide. Next, thanks, which I took from a steep angle, so now it really rises, but that's one way that you can look up at the painting. Now we're going to really get in detail. Next slide. Look at these colors, this blue and brown, this green. Next. Yeah. And next. This one just really makes me feel like drawing. If you've got your drawing out, go for it. Let's follow the blue at the top of this painting a little higher up. Slide 7, next slide, please. Yeah, that blue is now at the bottom and you can see the green extending above it. That inversion, I think, is really interesting to think about, leaving the flowers for the green water, blue water. Okay, a few more areas. Next slide. And then over on the left of the painting, there's this wonderful exuberance. Next slide. Let's see that yellow calligraphy. And there's a sort of purple waving line also. Broadening out again. Next slide. Oh, that's the purple line. And next. That purple now is lower down. You can catch sight of it in the lilies down there. I think this larger area feels very expansive after the closeness of the rough paint, and that's also interesting. Okay, next slide. And now we're going to move to our last painting. Next slide. This is the two paintings side by side in official photographs so that you can get a sense of these descending curves, which would be a very strong impression in the galleries themselves. And next, these two details similarly give you the feeling of the downward flow. Next. So this is the water lily pond from 1917 to 1920 in a private collection. And as we go through, I leave it to you whether you want to just look or write or draw or send your notes publicly. I'm going to go fairly slowly and quietly through the next 10 pictures, and you just follow your own instincts in looking and thinking. All right. Next slide, please. And next slide. Now we're going to go into that green area that's kind of in the lower left. Next. Love that. Okay, next. There's the signature, which is in a kind of cursive blue, and you can see how it kind of calls out to those other blue lines, which makes me want to look at the edges of the petals as they extend to the right. Next. And closer still, next. Yeah, I think that's astonishing. Now we're going to step back. Next. Now it looks positively defined. And step back. Next. The next area of the painting that we're going to look at is this purple loop toward the bottom. Next slide. And next. If you follow that rough paint in the upper left, you can see where the paint actually kind of stands out from the canvas. And above that is a green area that's one of these really interesting areas of inversion. And you'll see when we move to the next slide how everything that's sort of on the surface of this part, where it's all the purples and blues are on the surface, seems to kind of plunge and immerse under in the next slide. I find this completely abstract area very moving. And I'll just give you a moment here to write down any last things that you might want to have noted. Now it's time to climb back out. Let's have the next slide. Returning to the flowers. Next slide. And for taking our leave. Next slide. We were so far away, right? Now our last slide before we turn to conversation. There they are, 3 glorious paintings together. Have a chance to bid them farewell. Some of you have seen them in person. Some of you will get to see them in person again. Some of you will see them when the world has changed another time. And now we have a few minutes to have a conversation together. I think Nancy has returned. I want to say, please feel free to type your questions and observations into the chat. Nancy and I will pick things up to talk about. And let me just mention while you're starting to think of your questions, 2 further resources. The Art Institute allows you to zoom into their digital collection, and you can check out the sites that we'll post in the chat. The Art Institute Collections website and the incredible digital Monet catalog, which is a really great resource. Also, I do keep this notebook that Nancy mentioned at rachelcohen.com. I've been posting about the Monet show and the El Greco show, and we'll continue to do that. So some of these images will be there again if you are curious to revisit them. And I Instagram them at Rachel Cohen Notebook. Yeah, thanks. So those things are there, and I see some questions coming up in the chat. So
yeah, Rachel, we've had a few people commenting or asking about the eyesight, the role of his declining eyesight. I believe he had a condition that started around 1914 that worsened. Do you want to make more comments about that?
Yeah, I'm not an anatomical expert on his eyes, but he had cataracts, and it was a complicated thing. It worsened. There was a period when he was painting, and he was convinced that he was painting really well, and his friends were saying, "Your eye, there's something wrong with your eyes." And then he had cataract surgery, and then he was quite troubled and disturbed by some of the paintings that he had painted, and so there continues to be controversy about if those paintings should be included as part of his intended corpus. And then the cataract surgery was relatively successful, so that made a difference. And then he felt more confident about the painting after that. But there's a lot of detailed work by scholars about it. But I think one thing to emphasize that somebody in the panel has some detailed information, or somebody in the chat has shared some detailed information. Great. one thing that I think is good to emphasize is there can be a tendency to sort of diagnose painterly intentions, like the fact that Monet is interested in becoming abstract then becomes a problem of his eyesight. And I tend to think that that reduces the artistic complexity of the move. I think he was genuinely really interested in the abstract explorations he was making at the end of his life. I don't think those were a default because he couldn't see that well. Of course, he was constrained by his physical reality, as we all are. But I think it's important to think of that as innovative rather than reactive.
Yeah, on the topic of Monet's eyesight, maybe in a more conceptual sense, Rachel, I wanted to touch on, you had written, in preparing for this program, you had written that Monet's special way of looking again and again, noticing the subtle changes in familiar landscapes at certain times of day, certain seasons, is especially resonant in this period when our own looking is confined to a particular window. So I'm wondering if you want to say a little bit more about how, the conceptual, not literal way he was looking might influence the way we're looking.
Yeah, that's a nice question too. Yeah, I think that that is something that draws me to Monet and has for a long time. He's famous for these series of paintings where he's painting the same thing at different times of day. And in the show, you can see beautiful examples of the haystacks or the cathedrals, the kind of moments of thinking, what's the slant of light? What's the weather condition? But of the same territory. And I do feel that a lot of us in our looking have these kind of constraints right now, that we're all at home a lot of the time. Maybe there's a certain window, maybe there's a certain walk in a neighborhood that's become a lot of our sensory stimulation and our sense of the world right now. So I find it very helpful to be looking at Monet and thinking about what can be made of that kind of close and repeated looking, of going and going again and seeing slight differences in the light. That kind of close comparison is it's very illuminating and very restorative, I think. It's a way of recording the passage of time when it's a little bit hard to tell what time it is or what's happening. And I think that it's interestingly related to a sense of continuous time and things changing over time. It looks like there's a couple of questions about his mood and whether he was aware of suffering, and what somebody asked if he painted to music. I don't think so, although that's possible when he was doing studio work, when he was out in the gardens painting. I think that would have been technologically hard, though maybe. I do think he might have had moods in mind. That's a question from Leslie Amper. To me, they feel very coherent in terms of mood. And I saw a comment in the chat as we were moving through the exhibition together that it's interesting that such diverse colors seem to feel coherent and to come together in that way. And I do think that's part of the key to it. Like when he chose a palette for an individual painting, he was choosing things which seemed very far apart and then really insisting on their relationships and on letting you think through what those relationships might be. And that's part of how each one gets its very distinctive mood.
I saw a couple of really interesting comments. One from Lawrence, who have to scroll up a little bit, and below that from Francine. I wonder, Rachel, do you see those ones? I can read out.
And somebody's built on Francine's question, could the water lily be a symbol of hopefulness? I don't see the original Francine question. Go ahead and read that.
Francine wrote, many artists during and after World War II, Picasso, for example, changed the tone of their work to reflect the times. Is it fair to say that while Monet was aware of the suffering, per the earlier quote, he didn't reflect this in his work?
Well, I guess it sort of matters how you think about reflecting. I guess to me, these paintings do seem to really reflect a very acute awareness. And as somebody said, building on the question that there might be a sort of symbolism of hope in the paintings. I think um, I guess I find this in my own work. Sometimes I think, oh, you have to write directly head on about the troubles we're facing because we're facing so many right now. And then I think, but sometimes only facing the troubles, like were he to paint fallen soldiers, which he could see, or amputees who were walking around in his close vicinity, that of course would give a very direct representation of the war that was happening. But in another way, if has confidence in us as viewers that we're able to hold that in mind, that context in mind, and he was in some ways painting for his contemporaries in France who he knew were very aware of the war, didn't need to remind them that the war was happening. If we can put ourselves in that state of mind, then I think the paintings are very clearly a conversation about the world. Somebody said that signature looked blood red to them, and I think that's true. Like, I think you would see a turbulence in the colors, and it would give you certain kinds of associations if you were living in a war-torn moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I saw a couple of other questions also about treating painting like sculpture and moving around it. I think that's true. That is something I'm interested in, and it's something that I think you can do with details, photographic details. I think when you look at a painting, your sense is of a whole, and when you photograph it, very often your instinct is to photograph the whole thing so that it's all there. But art historians and casual museum goers alike often find that something of their feeling for the piece is really captured in a smaller thing. And it's not only that you're getting much closer to it, but that the texture of the paint is raised and giving you a kind of physical, spatial sense, but also that you move around with regard to the painting, and that is it's not assuming that there's one stance from which to see the painting. So having a variety of photographs that are almost like a kind of cubist collage of the painting gives you this range of different spatial projections.
Yeah. Changing gears a little, and maybe this will give you a chance, Rachel, to read through, but as I'm kind of talking through, but there was another comment from Mary about how much did Monet work from memory. One of the interesting things I thought in doing my own reading for this conversation was just sort of how much he changed later in his career to not doing instantaneous impressions as he, in the 1860s, but instead working sometimes months or even years on the same canvas over and over. And as far as her question about this set of work, I imagine he would have worked directly from the subject, just setting up his easel in his garden pretty much on a daily basis for the course of, it's pretty remarkable to think that he chose this motif and really painted it for over 3 decades, right?
Yeah, that is amazing. I think actually these late paintings, some of them he did in his studio. He had this studio constructed in 1916 in order to house the very large water lily canvases. And so then I think he was painting more from memory, and also the weather would no longer match the weather of when he had first started something. So he would be working partly from memory. I think that the one thing that kind of happened is that in the until 1900 or something, there was this, or even somewhat after, there was this idea of capturing all these different moments, as you said, Nancy, and he would work really hard to get exactly the weather conditions, and then he would abandon the canvas in despair because the weather had changed and he could no longer capture it, and then he would come back and try to do it again, and he would have 80 studies of the same thing, and he would be looking through them trying to find the one that matched the weather. But later, I think what he was doing is kind of overlaying his own internal impressions of something, so that the worked and reworked late canvases have this quality, although the paint is kind of flat and matte. there's a sense of layered emotional understanding that's a little hard to figure out how that comes through, but it's very powerful.
Yeah, and I just wanted to share a quote that I really liked of Monet's in talking about this kind of period of his work. He said, quote, "I set up my easel in front of this piece of water which adorns my garden with its coolness. It is only 200 meters around, and its image aroused in you the idea of the infinite, as in microcosm, the existence of the elements and the instability of the universe which transforms itself every moment before our eyes."
Yeah, it's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that's connected to an observation I noticed in the chat, somebody who'd been at Giverny, and reminds us that the pond and the bridge are actually quite small. And I think that's an experience that people have when they're there, that there's, in the paintings, this sense of infinitude, really, of this incredible opening and depth and reach, but it's a little area. And I think that's also relevant for us right now, when each of us confined in our little area and looking for kind of infinities within a narrow confine. Oh, thank you for putting the quotation there. Yeah.
I had a request from Judith to answer an earlier question. I was wondering if Judith or Bruce could repost that question. We might have time for just a couple more.
The chat is really wonderful. There's so many of us here in the room together, and there are a lot of, I recognize people, painters I admire, esteemed colleagues, old friends, Art Institute people, and people I definitely have never met who are in faraway places. So it's really wonderful to have this kind of international conversation about what people are noticing, and for everybody to have brought their own resources in this way. I appreciate that so much. Somebody asks, I concentrated on the last paintings, and how does the exhibition link them to earlier paintings and to the Chicago's role in establishing the Monet in the American market. That's a whole wonderful subject, and the exhibition treats that in very interesting depth. I think it's endlessly interesting to me to try to understand how Chicago kind of had the vision for that. I think a significant amount of credit goes to Martin Ryerson and the Ryerson couple, who were very important in pursuing a lot of the paintings. But many are in private collections in Chicago. There are many different collectors who saw the possibilities of Monet, and there are many interesting answers as to why that might be. How Monet influenced American Impressionists. Oh, these are vast questions. I would love to address them, but I guess I do write about these issues, both about Chicago and about the influence on American Impressionists. So I would send you to my website, for lack of a better, for lack of time to really piece that out.
Rachel,
go ahead.
We do have just a couple minutes left, and I wanted to ask you a question about, so in Austen Years, your book, you write about living through turbulent times with Jane Austen. And so in thinking about Monet, was wondering whether you see a parallel between Austen, the sort of reasons people would reach for Austen in a turbulent time, such as the ones we're living in, and similarly to reaching for Monet. And you even ask, there's an excerpt of Austen Years that's published in the New Yorker, was this action kind of a retreat, a seclusion, a way of kind of, avoiding what's going on in the world? Or is it actually sort of an attempt to find a way forward with aesthetic reassurance? So I'm wondering if you see that parallel between Austen as a writer and Monet as a visual artist.
It's a really nice question, yeah. And it's a way for us to take leave. I think we just have a couple more minutes. What I was going to say is that both Austen and Monet really bear and reconsideration. Like, they themselves were artists who reconsidered a fairly small territory over and over many years, and found riches in that. And for me, the period of my life that I wrote that book in was a period when my father had died and we had two little children. And both of those things really put me in a position where I was wanting to go back over a lot of territory, both in memory and in imagination, so that they're both artists whose work is very suggestive when you're in that kind of mood, which I think many of us are right now, grappling with different griefs and trying to imagine a future from a space that looks quite different. Both Austen and Monet were very gifted at understanding when they were in a rupture, that they were in a kind of rupture in time, and in thinking, how does one get through that? What kinds of habits and practices can I establish that can lead me forward? And how can I connect what seems like a forgotten past to what seems like an unimaginable future? So I think that aspect of their work has been important to me, was important in the local circumstances of my own losses, and now continues to be important in a larger landscape of transformation and loss that we're all in. So I really want to thank all of the people who came today. It was wonderful to have your presence and company, and to be able to go through this show together. And I hope that our paths will cross again. I saw somebody asking about the recording of this, and I think the Art Institute will announce on its website how the recording is going to be available, whether through YouTube or through another way.
Yeah, I think we'll, hopefully everyone gets our newsletter, and I'm sure we'll do a posting on our website when it is ready, though I don't know the exact date of that at this time, but we definitely hope to share the recording later on. And just in case anyone missed it, I'm repasting the resources for further exploration, because like Rachel already mentioned, there's a lot more resources on our website and also at Rachel's site in the Frederick Project and her other writings to keep thinking about our conversation today. So thank you, Rachel. Thank you everyone who attended. Thank you, Devin and Kathy behind the scenes, and hope you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and thank you all for being here. Be well.